we have our last speaker now, which is, I think, the speaker with the highest internet fame on this conference. It's Cory, Doctorw, science fiction writer, political essayist, civil rights activist, and one of the authors of my favorite weblog, Boing Boing. So please welcome Cory Doctorw.
Thank you very much. Actually, the last time I spoke in this room, it was Chaos Communications Congress, so it's a slightly different crowd today and not so much yerba mate rolling around in the aisles. I'll start by apologizing because I have the misfortune to have been born in the Anglosphere, and so I'm effectively monolingual, and I'm also a fast talker. So here I am in Germany speaking quickly and not in German. So when I speak too fast, by all means do this, and I'll slow down. So the world is made out of networked computers. We don't these days really have cars or airplanes or houses. We have computers we put our bodies into. When you climb into a modern car and get on the Autobahn, you are trapped inside of a computer that is hurtling down the road at 120 kilometers an hour, surrounded by other people likewise trapped in their computers, hurtling down the road at 120 kilometers an hour. The Boeing 747 I flew from Toronto to London in last night was effectively a flying Sun Solaris workstation in a very fancy aluminum case connected to some tragically poorly secured SCADA controllers. And of course, a new modern building, anything that's going up with a crane today, is just a computer that you put your body into. Take the computers out of that building and it will be uninhabitable almost immediately. Leave the computers out for a full turn of the seasons and you'll be better off tearing it down than trying to remediate it. But it's not just that we have our bodies inside of computers these days. We increasingly have computers inside of our bodies. The other day, I was in an airport lounge, and as you do when you get to the airport lounge, I ran and grabbed the only electrical outlet to charge my laptop. And in came a man who said, "Do you mind if I use that?" And very affronted, I said, "Well, I was here first." And he said, "But I have to charge my leg." And he rolled up his trousers and showed me his artificial leg, which he indeed needed to charge up, and I gave him the outlet. Those of you who are my age or a little older grew up with the Walkman. Those of you who are a little younger grew up with MP3 players. All of us have logged enough punishing earbud hours that there will come a day, if we live long enough, when we will need hearing aids. And it's vanishingly unlikely that that hearing aid will be a beige, retro, hipster, transistorized, analog piece of plastic. It is going to be a computer that we put inside of our bodies, and that computer will know what we hear. It will have the power to tell other people what we hear. It will have the power to interfere with what we hear. And so getting computers right matters. Now, every problem in a world made out of computers has a computer involved with it. And that means that increasingly our policymakers look to regulating computers as a means of solving social problems. Now, as it turns out, we've been running an experiment in achieving policy goals by regulating computers for about 15 years now. And by examining how that's worked out for us, we can get a glimpse of what the future might look like. Now, of course, I'm talking about the copyright wars. Back in the 1980s, you may remember that there was all kinds of stuff on our software to keep us from copying it. You put a floppy disk in the drive and it would check to see whether or not you'd satisfied some condition. Maybe the disk had to have an intentionally introduced defect that wouldn't be present on a copy of it. Or maybe you had to enter in a certain word from the manual. Or maybe you had to have a piece of plastic plugged into one of your precious printer ports to make sure that it was the actual legitimate computer and not or the software and not a copy that you'd made. And despite all these various methods, if you cast your mind back to these days, one of the things that will immediately become apparent is that none of this stuff worked at all. It was just rubbish. Conceptually, it was founded on an impossibility. Here's how it was supposed to work. The idea was that you'd have a supplier who would scramble a message. Right? They'd scramble a piece of software, they'd scramble a game, they'd scramble a song, they'd scramble a movie, and they'd give it to you. And they'd give it to you in a player that had, hidden somewhere in it, the keys to unscramble the message. And then they would cross their fingers and hope that you never got the keys out of the player. Because what the player would do is every time it ran, it would check to see whether or not you were allowed to have access to the scrambled media. And if you were, it would unscramble it, but then it would throw it away when it was done. And once you had the keys, you could write a player that didn't do this stuff. You could write a player that saved the file. You could write a player that always descrambled the file. That is not security. It has a kind of cargo cultish resemblance to security, but it doesn't stand up to inspection. In the real world of cryptography, in PGP and GPG and SSL, we have notionally three parties. We have Alice and Bob, who trust each other and want to exchange a message. And we have Carol, who's untrusted and is their adversary and is trying to read the message. And Alice and Bob scramble the message using a modern cipher system, some fiendishly clever piece of mathematics. And the feature of that cipher system is that provided that you don't have the key, you can never find out what the message is. So Alice and Bob share a key, and Alice and Bob exchange the message, and they assume that so long as Carol doesn't have the key, it doesn't matter if she gets a copy of the message, because she won't be able to read it. But in the voodoo crypto world of digital rights management, you don't have Alice and Bob and Carol, you just have Alice and Bob. Bob doesn't trust Alice, but he sends her the message anyways, along with the keys, and then assumes that she won't be able to hang on to them. Not only that, it's not just Bob versus one Alice. It's Bob versus every Alice in the world. Anybody who wants to take a go at figuring out how to save the keys that Bob has so foolishly entrusted to Alice can join the Alice group just by buying a DVD player and seeing if she can recover the keys, or by getting a video game console or an iPhone and seeing if she can get a copy of the keys. It's Bob versus the best resourced, cleverest Alice in the world. Bob versus the Alice who has an electron tunneling microscope. Bob versus the Alice who has a lab of bored grad students who know more about maths than anyone who doesn't work at the NSA. So there's a technical term that security experts use for this model. They call it wishful thinking. Because once Alice extracts the keys from Bob's player, she can share those keys. She can give them to other people. She can take the message that's now been descrambled, the movie, the game, the book, and give it to other people. She can tell other people where the keys are hidden and share that with other people so they can make their own players. Or she can make her own player that just obeys you when you say, please don't throw this message away after you've done descrambling it. So from the beginning, this model has been a fool's errand, a kind of break once, break everywhere exercise in futility that does nothing to prevent copying. In fact, it did kind of the reverse. The copy-restricted versions were like neutered versions. They were unable to reproduce themselves. And the ones that Alice liberated, the ones that she jailbroke, they were infinitely fecund. They could reproduce themselves forever at speed and at no cost. And if you just model out that ecosystem where you have two organisms competing, one of which can reproduce itself for free forever instantaneously, and the other one can never make copies of itself, it's pretty easy to predict what that ecosystem is going to be dominated by in a couple of terms. Now, when we talk about copyright and technology, we tend to get distracted with arguments that are, for our purposes tonight, somewhat pointless. Questions like, does digital rights management create sales, or does it inhibit them? Is it fair? Does it prohibit you from doing things that should be legal? Is it a good business strategy for the industry? Does it work? Can it prevent copying? But for tonight's purposes, these are the wrong sorts of questions to be asking. I mean, if you're me, if you're someone from that tiny minority of people who earn their living from creative works, they're important questions to have the answer to. But from the perspective of a policymaker or a computer scientist or someone just trying to get on in the world, these are rather beside the point. For the wider society, the effects of digital rights management are independent of all of these questions. That is to say that even if we knew for a fact that breaking other people's computers was good for sales, was totally fair, was great for the entertainment industry, and worked every time, we should still oppose it on grounds that are more important than any of that stuff. And to understand why, we have to unpack a bit of nerd complacency and realize that it's impossible to talk about technology without examining the legal code at the same time as we talk about the software code. Which brings us to a UN organization called Wipo, the World Intellectual Property Organization. It's a specialized UN body that makes copyright treaties. It has the same relationship to every dumb copyright law you've ever heard of that Mordor has to evil. It is kind of its origin node. And in 1996, Wipo passed the two most important treaties you've likely never encountered, the Wipo Copyright Treaty and the Wipo Performers and Phonograms Treaty, collectively known as the Internet Treaties. And what these did was created a special zone of legal protection for digital rights management, for the Alice and Bob model. They said that member states would have to make it illegal to break DRM, to extract keys from DRM, to tell someone how to extract keys from DRM, and to tell people where they might find information that might be useful to them if they were going to extract the keys from DRM. And they also set out rules that you've no doubt encountered, the rules for notice and takedown. That's the stuff that you run up against whenever you try to see a video on YouTube and it says, "I'm sorry, at the request of a rights holder, this has been removed." And under these incredibly lax rules, anyone can censor any web page just by pointing at it and saying without any proof, "This infringes my copyright." And if you lie, there are no penalties for it. Now, these have been spread around the world through the efforts of various US trade representatives. In Canada, where I'm from, we got it through Bill C-11. Here in Europe, it came in through the EUCD. It's part of the US-Korea Free Trade Agreement, the US-Australia Free Trade Agreement, and so on. And it's lately been wrapped up in excitingly sinister and secretive treaties like ACTA and the Trans-Pacific Partnership that the American president now says he can sign America into without any congressional approval. So where has all this stuff gotten us? Well, it's made it illegal to reverse engineer or interoperate with any technology that has DRM in it, which is a pretty sweet setup in the real world. Let's game this out and see how it works. Cast your mind back to 1996. In 1996, DVDs hit the market for the first time, just as the Wipo copyright treaties were being signed. In 1996, you could walk into a record store, which is another piece of anachronistic technology, and you could plunk down 1,000 euros out of one pocket and buy 1,000 euros worth of CDs, and take 1,000 euros out of the other pocket and buy 1,000 euros worth of DVDs. And then you could stick them in a vault. Now, you go and you open that vault 18 years later in 2014, and you'll find something remarkable. Most of the time, if you take technology and you stick it in a vault for 18 years, its value when you take it out again is negative. You have to pay someone to get rid of it. But the CDs have done something remarkable. They have grown in value. In 1996, all you could do with a CD was play it. In 2014, you can rip it, mix it, and burn it. You can make it an alarm tone and a ringtone. You can share it, you can stream it, you can make it part of your school presentation, you can put it behind your video presentations, and so on and so on and so on. But in 18 years, 18 years during which every other technology accelerated and accelerated and accelerated with no end in sight, not one new feature has been added to those DVDs. 18 years ago, you could watch those DVDs. Today, all you can do with them legally is watch them. And why is that? Well, it's not hard to rip a DVD. A Norwegian teenager named Jan Johansen and some of his friends figured out how to rip DVDs in the mid-90s, published the source code, and people have been ripping DVDs ever since. If you download a free piece of software like Handbrake or VLC, you can rip DVDs too. It's just illegal to rip DVDs. Not because there's a copyright infringement there. It's no more of a copyright infringement to rip a DVD than it is to rip a CD. But it's illegal to break the DRM. And so no one's ever productized it. No one's ever made an iPod for your DVDs. Instead, what's happened is all of the value latent in your DVDs in 1996 has been trousered by the entertainment industry. In 1996, all you could do is watch it. Today, if you want to library it, you have to buy it again on iTunes. Now, for my sins, I used to be part of the DVB, the Digital Video Broadcasters Forum, where standards for European digital television are set. And one day, I was opposite an ideological opponent of mine from the American Motion Picture Association, and he was advocating that digital television in Europe should have a flag that you could set on a per-program basis that said whether or not you were allowed to watch the show in a different room from the room that the receiver was in. So in other words, whether you could run a cable or use a wireless link to go from your sitting room to your bedroom and watch the show. And I said, explain this to me. What copyright system in the world lets someone decide what room you're allowed to watch a TV show in? He said, it's not about the copyright system. It's about the value. Watching a show in one room while you're sitting in another room has value, and if it has value, we have a right to it. Siva Vaidyanathan calls this the if value, then right theory of copyright. I call it the urinary tract infection business model. With a CD, all of the value flows in a healthy and satisfying gush. With the DVD, all of the value drips out one painful drip at a time with a price tag on every new feature. So now we have DVDs with their unskippable ads and their region checking. But beyond that, we have something that is quite invisible to you, but is probably the most important piece of it, which is something called robustness. If you're going to implement DVD players or any other digital rights management technology, you will be required as a licensing condition to implement it in a way that end users can't modify. It has to be resistant to user modification, which is to say that it can't run on free and open source software. And it's easy to see why. If you have a DRM system that when you say, I'd like to make a copy of this, says, check to see whether more than one copy has been made, and if more than one copy has been made, deny. You could just open up that code and change it so it says, check to see if more than 1 trillion copies have been made. And if fewer than 1 trillion copies have been made, then go ahead. So you can't ever have a system that doesn't trust the user if that system can be modified by the user. So why does this matter? Why does interoperability matter? Well, there's a lot of good reasons to want interoperability, but a crucial one is innovation. It's often the case that companies discount the potential value of an innovative feature and decide not to develop it. And some other company comes along and says, you know, I bet you we could make something out of this. And moreover, it's often the case that groups of users who are underrepresented in the market find ways to modify technology for themselves. Principal among these are users who have some sort of disability. And remember, each and every one of us is only temporarily able-bodied. If we live long enough, we will be blind or deaf or physically disabled or some combination of the three. And what we found over and over again is that groups representing people with disabilities have financed or enabled technologies that add assistive features to the core technologies that we use, the technologies that we're all going to use. But interoperability is really only the first casualty of digital rights management. I've saved the worst consequence of it for now, and that's transparency. How do you make digital rights management work? Effectively, to make DRM work, you have to have an anti-feature that enables computers to disobey their owners. You ask your user to do something. You say, copy this file. And rather than saying, yes, master, your computer says, I'm sorry, I can't let you do that, Dave. Now, to accomplish this trick, your computer has to have a little HAL 9000 program running on it, lurking in the background, waiting to see if you're doing something forbidden, waiting to interdict you, a supervisory process monitor that watches for forbidden commands and stops them. That's a very difficult thing to implement because it creates this adversarial relationship between the computer's owner and the computer's designer. The designer wants to do things that the owner doesn't want the computer to do. And ultimately, the only way to do this is to blind the computer. Back in 2005, you may remember that Sony BMG, one of the record labels of the day, shipped out 51 CDs, 51 audio CDs, 6 million copies of 51 audio CDs, that when you first loaded them into your Windows machine's CD drive, stealthily changed your operating system so that it could no longer see files that began with the $, SYS, and another $. And then it copied over a program that checked to see if you were ripping a CD, and if it did, it tried to kill that program. So the process monitor didn't see that file. The file system didn't see that file. If you opened a folder that had that program in it, they wouldn't see it. So immediately, virus writers began to write viruses that started with $, SYS, $. Of course they did, because Sony had thoughtfully punched a hole in the immune system of 6 million computers around the world, including, according to Dan Kaminsky, 300,000 computers on US military and government networks. And the virus writers rushed in to fill that niche. Now, after the fact, it came out that many security companies had known about this vulnerability for some time, but had not reported it because they were afraid that in explaining the ins and outs of a digital rights management system, they would fall foul of these global laws prohibiting disclosure of information that would be useful to people who want to remove digital rights management systems. Sony put a mote in your computer's eye. And for DRM to work, the existence and particulars of its secrecy must itself be secret. You can't know how DRM works, so you can't know if it's doing something it shouldn't be doing. Now there's a parallel here to our spook-crazed surveillance-happy society to work. The way the spooks do their job have to be secret. We have to have secret courts that rule on secret interpretations of secret laws based on secret evidence, and the ruling has to be kept secret. This kind of secrecy about secrecy is a poison, and it rots our systems from the inside out. Now, here at last is the real cost of digital rights management. When you add digital rights management to a system, you create this legal requirement for secrecy and secrecy about secrecy, for weak security. We've discovered through Edward Snowden that the NSA and the British spy agency GCHQ spend $250 million a year on two programs called Edgehill and Bull Run, whose mission is to subvert the security in computers, much the same way that DRM does, on the grounds that the way to make the state secure is to be sure that nobody in the state has good security, so the state can spy on them to make sure that they're not doing anything they shouldn't be. So our network infrastructure has been deliberately flawed, and anyone smart enough can find an exploit for these flaws, leaving the networked world vulnerable to crooks, hackers, spies, and creeps of every description. And that matters for reasons that are much more significant than the future of the entertainment industry or the war on terror. This is not about whether information wants to be free or not. I have to tell you, Information and I, we went away for a weekend last month. We went to the Lake District. We drank oaky Chardonnay. We cried. We talked about our parents. And at the end of it, Information gave me a long, soulful hug and whispered in my ear and said, I don't want to be free. I just want people to stop anthropomorphizing me. Because Information doesn't want a damn thing. Information is an abstraction, but people want to be free. And you can't make people free in an information age when their information technology is legally required to attack them. The computers in our desks and our pockets, the computers we insert our bodies into and into which we insert our bodies, have the power to set us free or to enslave us. When computers don't do what we expect them to, when they go around behind our backs and betray us, they expose us to horrible risks. In 2012, 7 hire purchase companies and a laptop security company in America, the laptop security company was called Designerware, settled with the American Federal Trade Commission, a consumer watchdog agency. And in their settlement, they said that they had preloaded these laptops that they rented out to mostly poor people, because that's who hire purchases laptops instead of buying them outright. They loaded them with laptop recovery software to let them get them back if they had been stolen or if payments stopped being made. This was software that let them covertly operate the camera, microphone, hard drive, screen, and keyboard of these computers. And in their settlement, they admitted that they had used this recreationally to make video recordings of their customers having sex, to make video recordings of their children in the nude, to intercept their banking credentials, to intercept their confidential and privileged conversations with their attorneys, to go through their email, to plunder their hard drives for interesting files to share around the office. And the Federal Trade Commission said, you must not do this anymore. You are no longer permitted to do this unless you put it in the fine print in the user agreement. And then all bets are off. That kind of functionality has found its way into lawful interception software used by police departments and government spy agencies all over the world. You in Germany will be familiar with the Bundestrojaner. But European companies like Finfisher and VuPen have been found selling comparable software as well as deep packet inspection software to allow surveillance of entire populations to Middle Eastern dictators, including Muammar Gaddafi. The idea of computers in our bodies is not science fiction. This month, the chief information security officer of an American chain of hospitals released a report on the information security dimensions of medical implants and medical technology, and found that implanted devices such as implanted pacemakers, implanted defibrillators, and implanted insulin pumps often shipped with Bluetooth interfaces that had default passwords like 0000, and once connected to, could be caused to administer lethal doses or lethal shocks to their wearers. Now, the bad news is that our policymakers are going to continue to make the mistake of making a computer that attacks its owner evermore, because everything we do from now on will have a computer in it, and so every problem will involve a computer, and every problem will invite the identical solution. Just make me a computer that runs everything except for the program that I don't like. We see this with every new NSA leak. Everyone with a problem wants to solve it by breaking our computers. And it runs up against a theoretical problem in computer science. I'm a visiting professor of computer science at the Open University in the UK. And computer scientists, sort of our 101, is something called Turing Completeness. It dates back to the great computer scientist and code maker Alan Turing, who established the architecture of the modern computer along with scientists at Princeton. And he described a computer that we now use as our principal architecture for computing that could run every program that we could compile, every program that we can express in symbolic logic. We know how to make that computer. What we don't know how to make is the computer that is Turing complete minus one, the computer that runs every program except for the one that the state doesn't want. And our closest approximation is a computer with spyware on it out of the box that can be exploited by people who don't have your best interests at heart. Now, those of us who are technologically savvy, those of us who are masters of the technological universe, are contemptuous of DRM. We know we can defeat it with a wave of our debugger, but it doesn't make it harmless. Our own complacency about this is the most dangerous thing about it, because the coming century holds 1,000 more fights about DRM, over computers that say, yes, master, versus computers that say, I can't let you do that, Dave. Those of us who are making technology are building the future. And we can put spyware and rootkits into our computers. We can put motes in their eyes and build a future that will make computers into levers that turn petty tyrants into global monsters and make the Stasi look like amateurs. Or we can resist. We can refuse to wave our hands at the deluded politicians with their quaint ideas about computer science, with the Hollyweird fat cats who say that they'll abandon the web as a platform unless we put DRM into HTML5 itself. We're told that this is a fight between extremism and freedom. But Edward Snowden showed us that the real extremism that threatens us today is the vile and unforgivable idea that technology is best used to shackle us and not to set us free. Whether you want to use our internet to plan a terrorist attack, to spy on everyone in the world in the name of preventing terrorist attacks, you are an extremist and on the wrong side of history. It's tempting to talk about whether technology can make us free or whether technology will enslave us. But the answer to both questions is yes, potentially yes. The right question is not, will technology make us free? The right question is, how do we make technology that sets us free? It's important to note all the ways in which technology takes away our freedom. It's important to talk about those leaks. It's important to talk about surveillance. It's important to talk about the digital divide. But not because technology can't make us free, but because this shows us where our technological freedom efforts should be concentrated. This allows us to alarm people who haven't quite yet gotten the message that technology has the power to take away our freedom or to give it to us. But in case you don't know, in case you're asking yourself how urgent is it, this project of using technology to set us free, it is as urgent as it can be. In case you're wondering how hard you should be working on this, the answer is as hard as you can. If you're a toolmaker, if you're a hacker, if you're starting a business, go secure by design. Ground your business model in making people more free, and you will not only find an opportunity to get rich, but an opportunity to make a world that your children will be happy to live in. Now, I'm an artist, and I make my living from the sale of entertainment product on my ability to convince you to part with your money to let me entertain you with a made-up story that helps you pass the long, dreary hours between the cradle and the grave. And I think DRM is rubbish and of no use to me for reasons I've gone on to about at considerable length in this talk. But even if I wasn't convinced that DRM was the only way to make a living, earning a living telling my funny made-up fairy tales, I still wouldn't go for it. I would go and get a real job, because as much as I like taking my family to Disneyland Paris, or buying my daughter nice clothes, or paying our mortgage, I want a fair and free world for my daughter even more. And I think you should too. Talking about whether DRM works or not is like talking about whether torture or mass surveillance work or not. Sometimes mass surveillance may catch a criminal, but it is never proportionate. If you have a safe, and you have someone who knows the combination to the safe, and you have enough cigarette lighters, you can probably find the combination to the safe. But we don't get the combination to safes that way, because it is unthinkable and it is not the act of a civilized person. Turning a computer that knows your every secret, that knows your social relationships, that follows you into the toilet, that follows you into the bedroom, that knows everything about you and can compromise you in 1,000 ways, large or small, into someone that works for the enemy is never the right answer. There is no way for us to fight oppression without devices and without networks. So we must build the freedom layer into our devices and networks. Now, there's an amazing thing about computers, another theoretical thing from the realm of computer science, and it's this. Information may not want to be free, but the universe wants us to have secrets. We know how to use modern cryptography to scramble messages so well that if every hydrogen atom in the universe did nothing from now until the heat death of the universe but try to descramble it, they never could. If we build good crypto into our systems, we can build that freedom layer. We can become cyber optimists. We can secure the network and use it to coordinate the struggle for freedom. We can use it to seize the means of information and so liberate the planet. Thank you.
Cory Doctorw.
Ladies and gentlemen, Cory Doctorw. Thank you very much.
So I think we have some time for questions.
So are there questions to Cory?
I remind you, a long rambling statement followed by what do you think of that is technically a question, but it is not a good one.
Questions? 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 I was asking this minister showing up recently on this stage, why don't we establish a law asking for secure products built in by default?
Well, I think that we have what economists call a moral hazard. Many elements of the establishment feel like cybersecurity is a matter of ensuring that computers aren't secure so that they can break into them. I mean, if the NSA has been spending $250 million a year undermining security, it's pretty obvious why lawmakers aren't making laws to ensure security. I would like to see evidence-based policy about our computers. For example, when the European Union introduced its privacy directive, they established a category of information that is a nonsense. They established something called pseudonymous information. And this is information that it's had its identifiers removed in such a way that it can't be re-identified. And pretty much every computer scientist in the world says that doesn't exist. But by taking the legal step of pseudonymizing your information, you get the ability to sell it on without having any regulatory burden on you. Now, it's not a coincidence that the Privacy Directive was the most lobbied directive in the history of the European Parliament, and then it came out with something that is demonstrably and unquestionably junk science as its main conclusion. And I think that kind of goes a long way to explaining it. It's also the same reason we don't have effective curbs on carbon emissions in our policy. It's also the reason that for a long time we couldn't figure out whether or not cigarettes were bad or good for you. It's because we have a system that has built into it a certain baseline of inherent corruption, and the public interest has to be sufficiently felt to overcome that baseline of corruption before we get policy that reflects real evidence.
Okay.
Thank you very much. We have to... Is there a really important question? I know there are many, because there are many topics you touched upon.
Well, I understand it was all very self-explanatory and not at all controversial, so I'm not surprised.
So thank you very much.
All right, thank you all.
Thank you enormously.
Thank you.